What if a grand manor stood empty for decades, not because it was cursed in any simple way, but because every person who came close to buying it uncovered the same buried truth and quietly walked away? Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment on where in the world you are watching from today. There are certain houses that keep their reputations longer than they keep their owners. Long after the names attached to them have faded from deeds and family Bibles, long after the last wagons stop using the original drive and the paint begins to peel from the shutters, the house itself remains, carrying something forward that the people around it never fully put into words. Ravenhill Manor was one of those houses. It stood in the hills of southwestern Virginia on a rise of land, so deliberate and commanding that it seemed less like a home than a statement someone had carved into the ridgeline. Even from a distance, it had the kind of symmetry and discipline meant to impress. Tall brick walls darkened by weather, white columns at the front portico, narrow upper windows that caught the evening light, and broad acreage rolling away below it in fields and timber that would have made the property desirable by any practical measure. It was exactly the sort of estate men were supposed to compete for, the sort of place meant to pass from one powerful set of hands to another without ever losing its sense of authority. But Ravenhill did not pass cleanly into new ownership. It lingered. That was the first thing people remembered when they spoke of it at all. Not that it was ruined, because for a long time it wasn't. Not that it was worthless, because the land alone would have justified the asking price more than once. And not even that it was haunted, because mountain people had words for hauntings, and Ravenhill inspired a different kind of caution, something less theatrical and harder to explain. It was a house that stayed available, a house that could be toured, inspected, discussed in legal offices, admired from the road, and nearly purchased by men with money and ambition, yet somehow never truly taken. Every few years someone would come close. A banker from Roanoke, a widow's brother from Lynchburg, a land investor looking to expand farther into the high country, an attorney handling an estate division who thought he might secure the property through a private arrangement before it went to open sale. The pattern never changed. Interest would be shown, papers would be drawn up, a visit would be made. Then something would cool, the tone would change, the matter would quietly dissolve. No one ever offered the same explanation twice. Sometimes the timing was wrong. Sometimes the roof needed more work than expected. Sometimes the boundary survey raised complications. Sometimes family claims proved too tangled, and yet the valley had a way of holding on to what repeated often enough. People noticed that Ravenhill was always almost sold and never kept. They noticed that those who came back down from the ridge after walking its halls did not usually speak about what they had seen in any detail. They became vague in a hurry. Practical men turned reflective. Confident men grew distracted. A few would say only that the house was not what it seemed, then refused to say another word. Others would laugh too quickly and insist they had simply found something better elsewhere, though their voices carried the strained note of men trying not to revisit a thought they wished had never lodged in them at all. And over time, the question itself began to disappear. That may be the strangest part of stories like this, how a mystery can survive not because people keep pursuing it, but because eventually they learn to step around it. Ravenhill Manor remained where it had always been, high above the valley, watching seasons pass over fields that no longer produced what they once had, and trees creeping closer to the old drive with every passing year. The brick held, the columns stood, the windows reflected the sky with a kind of cold patience. From below, especially in the late afternoon when shadows gathered in the folds of the hills and the light caught the upper facade just so, the place still looked magnificent. It still looked expensive. It still looked like something a man with vision might restore and claim as proof of his own importance. But no one did. And after enough failed attempts, the people living in that part of southwestern Virginia stopped treating Ravenhill Manor like property and began treating it like weather or a scar in the landscape, something fixed and unpleasant that no longer invited discussion. Children were told not to go near it. travelers were given directions that happened not to mention the road leading up to the ridge. Older people, when pressed, would say only that some houses go empty because they are too far gone to save, and others go empty because saving them would require knowing exactly what happened inside. Ravenhill, they would say, belonged to the second kind. To understand why Ravenhill Manor remained empty for so long, you have to go back to the family who built it, because houses like that do not become what they are by accident. They are shaped from the beginning by the people who imagine them, by what those people value, what they fear, and what they are determined never to let the outside world see. The Ravenhills arrived in southwestern Virginia in the early 1850s with money, land ambitions, and the kind of disciplined public manners that made communities trust them faster than they should have. Edmund Ravenhill was the figure most people remembered first, a man spoken of in county papers as industrious, forward-thinking, and unusually cultivated for the region. He dressed carefully, spoke with measured politeness, donated to church repairs when it benefited his standing, and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who expected to be listened to. His wife, Eleanor, was described in the language people reserve for women they do not fully understand, but are determined to praise anyway. Graceful, composed, deeply proper. She hosted dinners with silver laid out precisely, kept fresh flowers in rooms most households would have considered too formal to use, and maintained an atmosphere inside Ravenhill that impressed visitors so thoroughly that many came away speaking less about the family themselves than about the order surrounding them. And order was the word people used more than any other. The manor reflected that obsession from the beginning. It was not merely large, it was arranged. The approach road curved in such a way that the front facade revealed itself slowly and to best advantage, as though the house understood staging. The windows were symmetrical where guests would notice them, the parlors spacious and balanced, and the public rooms designed to communicate taste without extravagance. Everything a visitor was meant to see had been thought through in advance. The library with its dark shelves and controlled warmth, the dining room with its polished surfaces and long sightline to the eastern windows. The front staircase is broad enough to suggest confidence, but not so grand as to seem vulgar. Ravenhill Manor presented refinement the way a courtroom presents authority, carefully and with purpose. But even in those early years there were details that troubled people once they let themselves think about them. Workmen hired during construction later gave inconsistent accounts of how the house had been built. Some claimed certain interior walls had been altered after the main structure was nearly complete. Others said measurements taken from the outside did not always match what they found within. A mason from a neighboring county reportedly remarked after finishing part of the foundation that the lower level seemed overbuilt for what the plans required, as though weight were being carried in places where no ordinary room should have been. He was not hired again after making that observation aloud. A carpenter who helped frame the west side of the house told his brother that Mr. Ravenhill had very fixed ideas about which doors must lock from the outside and which hallways needed to remain narrow enough that two people could not pass comfortably abreast. It was an odd concern in a family home, though oddness alone is rarely enough to alarm anyone at first. People simply store such things away until later, when later finally gives them meaning. The town, of course, saw only what it was meant to see. It saw a respected family building a seat of permanence. It saw money flowing into the area, wagons bringing timber and stone and fine hardware, visitors arriving from farther east, and church attendance increasing whenever appearances required it. It saw discipline in the Ravenhill children, silence among the household staff, and a level of privacy that could be mistaken for dignity if one were inclined to be generous. And most people were inclined to be generous, especially toward wealth that seemed stable and self-contained. Communities and places like that often confuse restraint with virtue. A man who does not speak much is assumed to be serious. A woman who reveals little is assumed to be strong. A house with closed doors is assumed to contain less breeding than one with nothing to hide. Yet Ravenhill's refinement always seemed to produce unease in those who stayed long enough to sense the difference between order and control. Guests remembered the way conversations seemed to lower themselves in certain corridors without anyone requesting silence. Servants moved carefully there, not with the ordinary haste of domestic labor, but with a watchfulness that suggested they had learned the cost of being noticed at the wrong time. Certain parts of the manor were never included in tours, no matter how well a visitor was received. And though Edmund Ravenhill liked to speak of legacy, lineage, and the importance of preserving standards, there was something in the way he said such things that made them sound less like ideals and more like defenses being erected in advance. What the town did not understand then, and would spend years refusing to understand later, was that Ravenhill Manor had been designed for more than admiration. Respectability was part of it, yes. Status was part of it. But beneath the symmetry and polished wood and careful public manners, the house had been built with another purpose in mind, not simply to display power, but to direct it inward, to contain it, to keep certain realities out of sight while still keeping them close at hand. And, from the very beginning, the family who built Ravenhill understood that the most effective way to protect something rotten was not to hide it badly, but to surround it with such convincing beauty that no one wanted to look past the surface long enough to see what the house had truly been made to hold. By the time Ravenhill Manor had settled fully into local memory, the people who understood the most about what happened inside it were the ones least able to speak freely. That is almost always how houses like this preserve themselves. Not through walls alone, not through money alone, but through the dependence and silence of those made to move within them every day. The servants at Ravenhill left very little in the way of direct testimony. A household like that did not encourage diaries, and letters, if they were written at all, had a way of disappearing. What remains instead are fragments. Comments repeated years later. A remark overheard in a market town, a former kitchen girl telling her sister that the house had too many keys and too many rules. A stable hand who drank too much one winter and said he would rather sleep in a snow ditch than ever spend another night under that roof. None of it amounted to a formal accusation, but taken together, the fragments begin to form a shape. The staff at Ravenhill learned the geography of the house in layers, and not all of those layers were meant to be shared equally. New hires were shown the kitchens, the service passages, the laundry rooms, the back stairs, the storage rooms, and the paths from pantry to dining room and from yard to cellar. But there were also instructions given in a different tone, quietly and without explanation. Certain doors were not to be approached unless specifically ordered. Certain corridors were to be crossed quickly and alone, only when necessary. Lamps were not to be left burning in some parts of the west side after dark. No servant was to use the main staircase under any circumstance unless summoned. No one was to ask why a bell rang from a room that was supposed to be empty. And above all, if a locked interior door was found standing open when it should have been closed, the proper response was not curiosity, but immediate retreat and notification. It is worth paying attention to rules like that, because practical households do not create them without reason. Even strict families eventually reveal the logic behind their discipline. But at Ravenhill, the logic stayed hidden while the fear remained visible. Servants adjusted themselves around it the way people adjust around illness in a home that no one will name. They learned which floorboards creaked loudest near certain hallways and how to avoid them. They learned to keep their eyes lowered when carrying trays past doors from behind, which occasionally made sounds that did not belong in a respectable house. Not loud enough to become a public scandal. Never so dramatic that a person could later repeat them with certainty and feel secure in what he had heard, but enough. A chair dragged slowly across a floor in the middle of the night. A knocking from somewhere inside the walls. Footsteps in the upper west rooms on evenings when everyone in the household had supposedly retired below. Once, according to a story repeated years later by a woman who had worked in the scullery as a girl, there came the unmistakable sound of someone crying out and then stopping all at once, so abruptly that the silence afterward felt more frightening than the voice itself. No one investigated openly. That, too, tells its own story. The household patterns around those silences were as revealing as the sounds themselves. Meals were sometimes prepared in duplicate and sent where no listed guest was staying. Laundry disappeared into parts of the house where, officially, no rooms were in use. The maids understood that some linens were to be washed separately, and that questions about stains or tears would be answered not with explanation, but with dismissal sharp enough to make further curiosity expensive. Even the children of the house, when they passed servants in certain corridors, seemed trained to keep moving rather than linger. That kind of discipline does not happen by accident. It is taught, reinforced, and absorbed until it becomes an atmosphere. And the atmosphere was what people remembered most. Even those who served there only briefly later struggled to describe Ravenhill in ordinary terms. They did not call it haunted, at least not usually. The fear they carried from that place was more intimate than that. It was the fear of a household whose routines had been arranged around something active and concealed, something everyone was expected to accommodate without ever acknowledging directly. That is a particular kind of dread, the kind born not from one shocking event, but from constant proximity to a truth you are not allowed to form into language. The staff at Ravenhill knew that something in the manor did not belong among polished silver and formal dinners and carefully folded napkins. They knew there were rooms whose purpose did not match the family's version of itself. They knew the house held sounds that should not have existed and rules that only made sense if someone, somewhere inside those walls, required watching, confinement, or silence. But knowledge is not the same thing as freedom, and most of them had too little of the second to do anything with the first. So they stayed careful, they stayed quiet, they carried trays, cleaned hearths, scrubbed linens, and learned how to move around the shape of what frightened them. And because fear was never named plainly, it survived longer. That may be the darkest skill a house like Ravenhill can acquire. The ability to teach everyone inside it how to protect the secret simply by teaching them what happens to people who look too closely. The incident that should have broken the Ravenhills beyond repair took place in the winter of 1861, though even that date survives more through repetition than certainty. Some people later said it was January. Others insisted it happened in the last week of February, during a stretch of cold so severe that water froze in the wash basins by dawn and wagon ruts stayed hard as iron for days. What everyone seemed to agree on, at least in the fragments that remained, was that the person at the center of it was a young woman named Eleanor Vale, a distant relation on Lenora Ravenhill's side, sent to stay at the manor for reasons that were never explained consistently. In some versions, she had come for her health. In others, for mourning after a death in her immediate family. One account called it a temporary arrangement, while inheritance matters were settled. Another suggested, in the cautious language people use when they are trying to imply scandal without speaking it, that she had been sent away from somewhere else because Ravenhill was considered private enough to absorb difficulty without allowing it to spread. Eleanor was remembered, when she was remembered at all, as quiet, well-taught, and unsuited to the atmosphere of the manor from the start. A young woman with city habits, in a house that prized obedience over ease. One surviving church note described her as delicate in manner, but easily agitated by confinement, which is a strange phrase to use unless confinement had already become part of how she was being discussed. A seamstress in the valley, interviewed decades later by a local schoolteacher collecting oral accounts, claimed Eleanor had come into her shop once with one of the housemaids and asked, in a voice she kept very low, whether the road into town remained passable after dark. The seamstress said she remembered the question because it did not sound like idle curiosity. It sounded like planning. Then, quite suddenly, Eleanor ceased to appear. A disappearance like that should have traveled fast, especially in a place where households of that stature were watched closely, whether people admitted it or not. A young woman living at a prominent manor does not simply vanish without provoking gossip, search parties, accusations, newspaper mentions, or something. But what followed was stranger than open scandal. First came the claim that she had returned to relatives unexpectedly. Then came a quieter correction that she had taken ill and been removed for treatment elsewhere. Then a third version circulated, thin and unsatisfying, that she had never been intended as a long-term guest at all, and that local people had exaggerated her presence from the beginning. That kind of contradiction does not erase a story. It merely injures it until no one can hold it steadily enough to repeat with confidence. There was, apparently, some attempt at inquiry. A county clerk's ledger from that season contains a notation about a visit to Ravenhill regarding private domestic concerns, but the line beneath it is torn away, and the page shows signs of deliberate damage rather than age. A minister from a neighboring parish mentioned in a letter surviving only through quotation in a later account that the household had suffered a trial requiring discretion and Christian restraint. No names were attached, no details followed. More telling still were the witnesses who seemed briefly ready to speak and then withdrew. A stable hand reportedly told two men in town that he had seen lanterns moving behind the west side windows well past midnight the week Eleanor disappeared, and that he had heard raised voices from an interior section of the manor, where guests were not ordinarily housed. Within days he recanted, saying he had been drinking and remembered nothing clearly. One of the maids left service soon after and returned to kin across the state line, but when asked years later why she had departed so abruptly, she would say only that the house had become too close, and that she had no wish to revisit old winters. And then, as so often happens in communities dependent on the powerful, memory began doing the work that pressure alone cannot finish. People adjusted. They accepted the thinned-out version because the fuller one was too difficult to hold in place without consequence. Ravenhill continued hosting dinners. Edmund continued attending public matters with his usual controlled dignity. Lenora remained composed enough that women who distrusted her still found themselves borrowing the language of admiration to describe her. The family's surface did not crack. If anything, it hardened. By the end of a few years, Eleanor Vale had already begun to slip from town memory into that peculiar category reserved for truths people suspect but no longer know how to prove. Not forgotten exactly. Worse than forgotten. Half remembered. The kind of story older people would lower their voices around and then wave away before reaching its center. A name mentioned once, then replaced with silence. A winter referred to only as that season at Ravenhill. The implication of something shameful or criminal, or both, was buried so effectively beneath respectability and fear that even those who sensed its outline no longer trusted themselves to speak it plainly. And that may be the clearest sign that what happened there should have destroyed the family. Not that it did not matter, but that so much effort went into making sure it never mattered publicly at all. Houses like Ravenhill do not survive scandal with innocence. They survive by teaching everyone around them the cost of certainty until rumor becomes safer than testimony and absence becomes just another room the house knows how to keep locked. By the time Ravenhill Manor entered the long, slow decline that usually delivers a great house into other hands, the family that built it had already thinned into legal abstraction. Deaths accumulated. Marriages failed to secure the fortune they were supposed to stabilize. One son left and was never spoken of with consistency again. A daughter married into another county and died before she could claim much of anything. Edmund Ravenhill himself passed from the record with the same controlled vagueness that had followed so many other things connected to the house, and after Lenora's final years the estate seemed to lose the single force that had kept its surfaces intact. What remained was land, structure, debt, and an increasingly tangled chain of claims that moved through clerks' offices and attorneys' desks with the weary friction of property nobody trusted, but everybody believed ought to be worth something. On paper, Ravenhill should have sold easily. The acreage alone still had value. There was timber on the lower slopes, workable fields in the valley, a spring house that remained sound long after lesser outbuildings had begun to sag, and a main residence impressive enough to tempt exactly the sort of buyer who wants not merely land but a statement. That was the logic each new round of probate relied upon. So notices were drafted. Quiet inquiries were made. Men came out from town and from farther away to inspect, measure, consider, and imagine what the place might become under firmer ownership. Yet every time the process advanced toward something final, it bent strangely out of shape. The surveyors were usually the first to feel it, because surveyors are people who live by the comfort of things agreeing with themselves. A line is a line. A wall either stands where the plan says it stands, or it does not. But Ravenhill had a way of producing small but persistent contradictions. Exterior measurements would suggest one arrangement of rooms, while interior walks implied another. Hallways narrowed or lengthened in ways old plans did not explain. A rear section of the west side appeared larger in tax descriptions than in the architectural notes attached to a later estate filing. One man, hired in the 1880s to produce a full improvement map for valuation, wrote in the margin of his working copy that the house seemed subject to irregularity beyond practical expectation, then crossed the sentence out so hard the nib tore the paper. Another completed only the grounds and outbuildings, declining to finish the interior notation without giving a reason more specific than unsatisfactory conditions. Then came the attorneys, and with them came the paper trouble. Deeds did not quite match inventories. Inventories referenced locked rooms whose contents were never formally listed. Family correspondence mentioned alterations that never appeared in the official repair ledgers. A probate packet from one year referred to an interior chamber by a name not used anywhere else in the surviving papers, and when a later attorney tried to trace it, the reference seemed to disappear into a bundle of miscellaneous household accounts that had been tied and retied until chronology itself became difficult to trust. This was not the dramatic kind of fraud that announces itself cleanly. It was worse. It was attritional. The sort of confusion that wears down confidence, one discrepancy at a time, until even a determined man begins to suspect that resolution may cost more than possession is worth. Still, interest returned, because houses like Ravenhill continue to tempt people who believe that age and silence are simply obstacles waiting for a competent owner. A retired judge toured the manor with the intention of restoring it as a summer residence. He spent nearly 2 hours inside, emerged pale, and later told his associate only that some structures preserved too much of the intention with which they were built. A livestock speculator from farther west inspected the property line by line, seemed enthusiastic over dinner in town, then departed before sunrise without collecting the valuation notes he had paid to have copied. A pair of brothers once came prepared to divide the acreage and sell the house separately, practical men by all accounts, unimpressed by rumor. They walked through the lower floors, avoided one interior passage after speaking privately with the caretaker for less than 10 minutes, and by evening had decided the investment no longer suited their plans. No one heard them explain why. That sameness of ending became the real pattern. Not the inspections themselves, but their collapse into vagueness. Every prospective buyer arrived speaking the language of utility, expense, and opportunity. Every one of them left sounding strangely abstract, as if Ravenhill had shifted the conversation out of finance and into some area they did not wish to name aloud. Roof repairs could be calculated. Boundary disputes could be settled. Probate tangles, however irritating, could be unraveled by patient lawyers. But Ravenhill produced another kind of resistance, something that showed itself in the way men began avoiding certain parts of the house without being told to, or in the way questions about specific rooms would simply stop once those rooms had been approached. They would descend from the ridge quieter than they had climbed it, carrying the posture of men who had come close to a fact they preferred not to inherit. And after enough repetitions, the town ceased to treat failed inspections as surprising. They became part of the manor's ordinary behavior. Papers would be drawn. A carriage or later a buggy would go up the drive. Measurements would be discussed. Voices would lower. Someone would spend time in the house longer than expected. Then the familiar cooling would begin. The letters are unanswered. The deposit was not followed through. The explanation was offered thinly, or not at all. Ravenhill remained not unsellable in any legal sense, but untouched in the only way that mattered. It was always on the verge of belonging to someone and never truly did. As though the final barrier to ownership were not cost or disrepair, but recognition. As though anyone who came close enough to claim the house discovered that doing so required accepting more of its history than they had expected, and that once glimpsed, some histories make a property feel less like an acquisition than a burden waiting for a new name to attach itself to. The first person to leave a usable trace of the anomaly at Ravenhill Manor was not a relative or a servant, but a surveyor named Amos Bell, hired in the early 1890s during one of the estate's more serious attempts at valuation. Bell was, by all surviving accounts, an exacting man, the kind of professional who trusted numbers more than stories, and believed that most mysteries dissolved when enough patient measurement was applied to them. He had no particular interest in the folklore that already clung to Ravenhill by then. What mattered to him were dimensions, wall thicknesses, stair runs, window spacing, and the relationship between what a house presented from the outside and what it contained within. That was the level on which Ravenhill began to trouble him. At first, the discrepancy seemed small enough to blame on old construction. Exterior measurements of the west side suggested more interior volume than the plans accounted for, though not by a dramatic margin. A foot here, 18 inches there. In older homes, that was not unheard of. Walls settle. Builders improvise. Additions are made and forgotten. But Bell's field notes, preserved only in fragments folded into a later probate file, show that the inconsistency did not resolve itself as his work continued. It deepened. Hall lengths did not correspond cleanly to room widths. A service passage on the ground floor should have ended nearer the back stair than it did. Two upper windows visible from the southern lawn suggested a chamber or corridor between the blue room and the small west sitting room, yet no such space appeared on the interior inventory attached to the estate papers. Bell measured it twice, then a third time. Each result differed just enough to be maddening. That is when the work stopped being routine and became investigative. Bell requested the older drawings, including what was described as the original builder's draft and a later set of alterations filed after storm damage in the 1870s. The originals were elegant but incomplete, more presentation documents than working plans, all clean lines and balanced rooms, meant to communicate taste rather than practical truth. The later drawings were more useful, but they introduced their own problems. A wall on the west side thickened without explanation between one version and the next. A narrow secondary passage appeared in an elevation sketch, but vanished from the floor copy tied to the same packet. One notation referred to "closure completed as instructed," yet gave no indication of what had been closed or why. Another listed repair material is stone, timber, iron fittings, and plaster, in quantities too substantial for cosmetic work but too localized to suggest an ordinary renovation. Bell marked these contradictions in the margins, and if his tone in the notes seems restrained, the pressure of the pen does not. It cuts deeper where the house begins, refusing to make sense. He moved next to physical confirmation, which is where Ravenhill's deception became harder to dismiss as clerical sloppiness. On the ground floor, the west corridor terminated in paneled walls that sounded different when struck, one section giving back a flatter, more muffled response than the rest. The baseboards there had been reset at some point, not recently but more carefully than the surrounding woodwork. Upstairs, the rooms adjoining that corridor did not sit squarely against one another when measured from within. Their fireplaces aligned oddly with the exterior chimney mass. A closet in one bedroom ran shallower than the wall behind it should have permitted. Below, in the service level, the arrangement of storage rooms and stairs left a dead zone in the structure, a pocket of enclosed volume that belonged to no official space. Houses can hide voids by accident. Ravenhill had hidden this one with intention. The estate records, once read against the measurements rather than on their own terms, only made that intention clearer. An inventory from Lenora Ravenhill's final years listed keys for the front door, silver pantry, wine cellar, linen press, schoolroom, and inner west, a phrase that appeared nowhere else in the paperwork and was later crossed through so heavily it nearly tore the page. A carpenter's receipt from decades earlier mentioned custom hinges and an inward bar mechanism not associated with any known exterior door. A legal memorandum attached to one probate review advised that all disused interior partitions remain undisturbed pending final disposition, which is an unusually careful instruction unless someone feared disturbance would reveal more than dust and old framing. By then, Bell seemed to have understood that Ravenhill had not simply been altered over time but designed with layered access from the beginning. Public rooms where a visitor would expect them, service routes where staff would need them, and within that orderly shell, another arrangement altogether, one that redirected movement, concealed adjacency, and created an interior section the house officially denied possessing. A hidden passage, yes, or perhaps something more substantial than that. Not a priest hole or a smuggler's nook, but a true contained space, reachable, lockable, and intentionally erased from the respectable version of the house. Bell never fully opened it, at least not in any record that survives. That, too, matters. He came close enough to document the lie, but not, apparently, to finish exposing it. His last notes on Ravenhill grow brief and unusually hesitant. Volume is unaccounted for on the west interior. Evidence of deliberate closure. Recommend further inquiry only with full authority and witnesses present. Beneath those lines, in smaller handwriting that may have been added later the same night, appears the sentence that haunts the rest of the file. There is a room in this house the plans were made to forget. And once that possibility entered the story, everything that had seemed merely unsettling at Ravenhill began to gather around it. The silences, the movement rules, the strange inspections, the family's lifelong obsession with order. Houses built for display do not usually require hidden geometry, but houses built to keep something near, something controllable, unseen, and inaccessible except to those who already know how to reach it, very much do. Ravenhill Manor had been measured, drafted, taxed, inherited, disputed, and admired for decades. Yet at its center, folded into its west side like a swallowed truth, was a part of itself it had never intended the world to count. When the concealed section of Ravenhill Manor was finally entered in any meaningful way, it was not through heroism or revelation, but through the slow, humiliating work of property clearance. That is often how the truth emerges in houses built to suppress it. Not with thunder, not with confession, but when a wall gives under careful pressure, a panel shifts where someone has grown tired of pretending not to notice the seam, and a space that was meant to survive only in silence opens itself to air for the first time in decades. The room, if room is the right word, lay behind the west corridor, where the measurements had long refused to settle. It was larger than many expected and lower ceilinged than the surrounding floor, as though compression itself had been part of the design. The air inside was stale, in a way that seemed older than disuse alone, carrying dry wood, old fabric, and the faint mineral smell of plaster that had held too many seasons without light. There was no grand discovery at first glance, no dramatic tableau waiting intact, only the accumulated evidence of a place whose purpose had been denied so thoroughly that even its objects seemed to have learned silence. But objects speak when enough of them are left together. There were shelves along one wall, not decorative shelves, but plain fitted boards built for storage and weight. On them sat bundled papers tied with ribbon, gone brittle from age, ledger books wrapped in cloth, and several small boxes whose brass clasps had greened over. A narrow iron bed frame stood against the far side of the room, too slight for comfort and too fixed in place to feel domestic. One leg had been bolted directly into the floorboards. Near it was a washstand with no mirror, a chipped basin, and a pitcher whose glaze had crazed into fine hairline fractures. The lack of ornament mattered. Everything about the room had been stripped to function, but not to ordinary household function, to containment, to supervision, to duration. The papers made that clearer with every page. One ledger, written in a tight, controlled hand, believed to be Edmund Ravenhill's, listed dates, initials, food amounts, linen changes, and notes that were clinical in tone but grotesque in implication. Restless after dusk. No window access. Reading materials removed. Hands secured for the night. The entries ran for months at a time, then stopped, then resumed under a different set of initials. Another book appeared to track household expenses, but certain entries had been written over, names scraped away with a blade and replaced by the language of inventory, as though people had been converted into management problems and filed accordingly. There were letters, too, some unfinished, some never sent, folded into one another as if hidden in haste. A few were written in a young woman's hand, asking to be allowed outside, asking for a message to be carried, and asking whether anyone in town had been told she was unwell because she was not unwell, only not permitted to leave. One page ended mid-sentence after the words, "If this reaches anyone, please understand, they keep." There were children's things in the room, and that was where the emotional weight of the house seemed to change shape entirely. Not many, that almost made it worse. A single leather shoe with the sole worn thin at the toe. A small wooden horse with one wheel missing. A primer with several pages torn out, its inside cover marked with a name that had later been inked over so heavily the paper nearly split. A strip of blue ribbon folded into the corner of a drawer. These were not relics arranged for memory. They were remnants overlooked by erasure. The kind of items left behind when a life is handled as a problem to be corrected rather than a person to be mourned. Nearby, wrapped in linen and hidden beneath the false bottom of one storage box, were medical notes and household memoranda suggesting repeated disciplinary confinement, references to episodes, and recommendations that no staff member engage directly unless instructed. The language kept reaching for gentility and failing. It wanted to sound respectable. It wanted cruelty to resemble treatment, secrecy to resemble care, and imprisonment to resemble family necessity. It did not succeed. There were restraints as well, though even here the house had tried to keep its own manners. Not chains hanging theatrically from stone, nothing so simple and easy to condemn from a distance. Leather wrist straps lined with fabric that had once been soft, buckles made by a skilled hand. A fastening ring was secured beside the bed frame, where a casual observer might mistake it for some forgotten fixture if he did not look too long. Coercion in houses like Ravenhill was not crude, because crude things attract memory. It was systematized, it was measured, it wore the face of management and called itself protection. And through all of it ran the same terrible pattern. Names thinning into initials, initials thinning into marks, marks crossing into nothing. Eleanor Vale appeared, then disappeared. Another name surfaced in correspondence but nowhere in public records. A child's reference was preserved in laundry counts but absent from family genealogies. Pages had been cut from Bibles, lines scraped from inventories, household registers altered so that periods of confinement corresponded to illnesses that had never been witnessed outside the manor. The evidence did not reveal one single outburst of evil. It revealed maintenance, repetition. A private system sustained over years inside walls, polished enough to reassure guests that refinement lived there. That was the real horror hidden in Ravenhill Manor. Not madness in the romantic sense, not a curse, not one violent secret too shameful to confess. Something colder than that. A household that had built procedures around domination and disappearance, then protected those procedures with wealth, architecture, and the public performance of dignity. The room in the walls was not an aberration. It was the logical center of the house. Everything beautiful around it had existed, in one way or another, to keep it unspoken. And once those objects had been seen together, the silver, the child's shoe, the ledger entry, the unsent plea, and the restraint ring on the floor, it became impossible to think of Ravenhill as merely old or eerie or unfortunate. It had been designed to hold suffering in place and rename it until the people responsible could still sit down to supper and be called respectable. That is the kind of truth that does not stay in one room once found. It begins to move backward through every story told about the house, hardening them and darkening them until even the silence around Ravenhill starts to feel less like mystery and more like complicity that lasted far longer than anyone should have been able to bear. By the time the concealed room at Ravenhill Manor began to explain itself, the house no longer looked like the private sickness of one family. It looked like something larger and more familiar, which is often harder to bear. A secret that survives for years inside a household is terrible enough. A secret that survives because an entire community keeps finding ways not to confront it is something colder. It stops being only the story of what was done behind closed doors and becomes the story of what everyone around those doors decided they could live with, so long as it remained inconvenient to name plainly. That is the part people prefer to soften when they tell these stories later. They want the evil contained inside the manor because that keeps the boundaries clean. A bad house, a cruel family, a single site where the rot began and ended. But Ravenhill could not have endured as long as it did on family discipline alone. Wealth helps, architecture helps, fear helps most of all. Yet even fear needs assistance. It needs clerks willing to file vague language instead of specific complaints. It needs ministers who preach endurance where they should have demanded inquiry. It needs neighbors who hear something troubling and decide that distance is the same thing as innocence. It needs a town willing to let status turn uncertainty into silence. And this town, by all surviving indications, gave Ravenhill exactly what it needed. The preachers were among the first line of protection, though perhaps not deliberately at first. Men in those pulpits depended on donations, on social steadiness, on the cooperation of households influential enough to shape who was considered respectable and who was not. The Ravenhills gave money to repairs when it suited them. They attended visibly when appearances required it. They understood the value of being seen near religion without ever allowing religion to interfere too much with the internal order of their house. So, when concerns emerged, they were absorbed into the old language of family privacy, trial, burden, feminine frailty, and moral weakness, things to be prayed over rather than investigated. A minister might suspect. He might hear enough in confession or correspondence to feel the edge of something wrong, but suspicion is easy to convert into abstraction when the alternative demands courage and risks public rupture. Better, many seem to think, to speak of suffering in broad terms, and trust that God would sort what men found unpleasant to touch. The clerks played their part more quietly. Their contribution was paper, or rather the careful thinning of it. Names entered partially. Complaints recorded as domestic concerns. Property notations left imprecise where precision might have forced explanation. A room omitted here, a corrected inventory there, a damaged page that happened to remove the most useful line. No one alteration by itself would have looked like conspiracy. That is what makes bureaucratic complicity so durable. It rarely arrives dressed as villainy. It arrives as convenience, as deference, as the small accommodation made for a powerful family so that business may proceed without disturbance. A clerk does not need to understand the entire shape of wrongdoing to help preserve it. He only needs to accept that some households are easier not to trouble. Then there were the neighbors, and here the matter grows even more uncomfortable because neighbors almost always know more than they later admit. Not everything, perhaps, not enough to tell the story cleanly, but enough to feel when something is off, enough to notice that servants leave abruptly and refuse to say why, enough to remember that one guest stopped appearing and no funeral followed, enough to hear that wagons went up the drive at unusual hours or that lamps burned behind west-facing windows when no gathering had been announced. Rural communities survive on reading one another, and the same attentiveness that helps people endure hard winters can also teach them how to avoid truths that threaten the fragile arrangements of local life. A family like the Ravenhills employed people, lent money, influenced marriages, contracts, recommendations, introductions. To confront them openly would have meant not just moral conflict, but also practical consequences. Many chose not to confront anything at all, and after enough years, that choice hardens into culture. Children learn what subjects make their elders change tone. Young men learn which roads not to take after dark, not because they are dangerous in any direct way, but because some places are understood to belong to a category of trouble no one wants attached to his name. Women pass along cautions without sources. Officials adopt the local habit of stepping around whatever the last official stepped around. Memory itself begins conforming to the pressure. People do not exactly forget. They become selective. They edit instinctively. They tell the safe half of the story and leave the rest where it has always been, unspoken but active. That is why Ravenhill endured as more than an old manor with a private stain. It became a symbol of collective refusal, a house protected not simply by brick and locked doors, but by the surrounding willingness to call silence prudence, to call avoidance dignity, and to call fear respect. The family built the structure, yes. They laid the foundations of concealment and control. But the town, in ways large and small, helped keep the structure standing. It provided the atmosphere in which no one had to know fully in order to participate. It offered the most useful protection evil can receive, not admiration, not even agreement, but the continual decision by ordinary people that this, whatever this is not a fight they can afford to begin. And once you see Ravenhill that way, the house changes again. It stops being merely the site of cruelty and becomes an indictment of everyone who benefited from looking past it. The polished rooms, the altered records, the respectable dinners, and the closed doors. All of it begins to feel less like one family's corruption and more like a community's moral arrangement with itself. That is a darker truth than any hidden room, because hidden rooms can be opened. Ledgers can be read, objects can be brought into daylight. But the habit of collective refusal, the long local training that teaches people how to protect what they claim not to understand, lingers. It drifts outward from the house into the roads, the church pews, the clerk's desk, and the kitchen table. And by the time anyone is ready to say plainly what Ravenhill was, generations have already been raised inside the quieter lesson that some things are survivable only if no one insists on seeing them whole. By the time people began speaking of Ravenhill Manor as a property no one would take, the phrase had already become slightly misleading. It was not that no one wanted it. Plenty of people wanted it. They wanted the acreage, the timber, the commanding view from the ridge, the prestige of owning the grandest house in that part of the county. They wanted the columns and the brick and the old family name still clinging faintly to the place. They wanted, in other words, what such houses are built to promise: permanence, distinction, the chance to step into a structure that already knows how to make a man look important. Wanting Ravenhill was never the problem. The problem was getting close enough to it without learning what ownership would actually require. Because that was the pattern. When you strip away all the evasions, the serious buyers did not flee because of repair costs. They did not abandon the purchase because of probate tedium, though there was plenty of that. They did not change their minds over roofing estimates or road access or field drainage or any of the ordinary practical frustrations that attend old estates. Those reasons were convenient, respectable, easy to put in letters, but they were not the truth. The truth was that each serious buyer came near enough to Ravenhill's center to understand that the house was not merely old property burdened by rumor. It was evidence. It was an accusation. It was a structure built not only to display wealth, but also to contain the record of what that wealth had chosen to do in private. And once a man understood that, the calculation changed. Some of them learned through documents first: a packet opened too carefully in an attorney's office, an inventory whose language shifted just enough to suggest concealment rather than confusion, a floor plan that made no honest architectural sense until one accepted the possibility of deliberate omission. Others learned through the house itself, a corridor that ended where it should not, a wall too thick for its purpose, a room whose emptiness felt less like vacancy than removal, a caretaker who, through silence more than speech, made it clear that certain parts of the manor were not merely disused, but avoided with intention. However the knowledge arrived, it arrived the same way in the end. Not as a ghost story, not as superstition, but as recognition. They realized that buying Ravenhill would not mean taking possession of a beautiful, damaged home. It would mean stepping into the final position in a chain of stewardship built around concealment. It would mean deciding what to do with objects that should have become public scandal decades earlier. It would mean inheriting ledgers no decent man could read without feeling implicated, rooms no honest family could inhabit without either exposing them or becoming part of the same long silence that had protected them. It would mean sleeping above floorboards that had once held fear in place, and then dining beneath portraits and molding and polished wood, as if elegance were enough to absolve structure. For some buyers, perhaps, that moral burden emerged all at once. For others, it came slowly, a pressure that gathered during the visit and clarified only on the ride back down the ridge. But it came. That is why their explanations always turned vague. They could not say, at least not easily, that the house felt unfit for ownership in any ordinary sense, because doing so would require them to explain why. An explanation would have forced a decision. Tell the truth, and you become responsible for what follows. Stay silent, and you can still retreat with your comfort intact. Most chose silence. They called it timing, expense, legal complexity, and a poor fit for their purposes. But beneath those respectable phrases was the simpler fact that none of them wanted to become the man who owned Ravenhill after knowing what Ravenhill was. They did not want the obligations that knowledge creates. They did not want to be the one who either exposed the history and attached his name to its scandal or concealed it again and accepted the stain privately. That was the real title mystery. Ravenhill Manor remained unsold, not because people feared old houses, but because they recognized, however briefly, that this house demanded a choice between truth and comfort. And most people with enough money to buy such a place were also people with enough to lose. Thus, comfort mattered more. Ownership, in that light, began to feel less like opportunity than consent. To purchase Ravenhill was to agree to live inside a preserved arrangement of suffering, to let your children run across floors laid above erased names, to pour coffee in rooms whose dignity had been constructed specifically to distract from what lay sealed behind the West Side walls. Even greed has its thresholds. Even ambition recoils when the prize begins to resemble a witness that cannot be persuaded to forget. And so the buyers left. Not always dramatically, not with declarations, more often quietly, almost respectfully, as though backing away from the house without disturbing it further might also spare them from whatever judgment came with having seen too much. One by one they descended the ridge carrying the same private understanding, that some properties cannot truly be bought because what they contain has not been reckoned with, only stored. Ravenhill Manor was one of those places. It remained available in the legal sense and impossible in the human one. A house no one would take not because its value was uncertain, but because its value had been built around the careful management of pain, and anyone perceptive enough to claim it eventually understood that possession would make them heir not just to the land, but also to the burden of everything the house had been designed to keep quiet. The dark reason no one bought Ravenhill Manor was not superstition alone, though superstition made a convenient excuse. People let the house gather rumors because rumors were easier to live with than the truth. A haunted house can be avoided and laughed about in equal measure. But Ravenhill was something far more disturbing than that. It was a place built to hide human cruelty behind wealth, manners, and architectural beauty, and anyone who looked closely enough eventually understood it. That was the real burden of the house. Ravenhill was not just an old property with a bad history. It was a preserved accusation. Its walls, rooms, and records all pointed back to the same terrible fact. Suffering had been kept there deliberately, then disguised so carefully that the house itself became part of the lie. Buying it would not have meant simply restoring a grand old manor. It would have meant inheriting the evidence of what had happened inside and deciding whether to expose it or become the next person to live beside it in silence. That is why no one stayed. not because the roof leaked, or the title was tangled, or the locals whispered. Those were only the polite explanations. The real reason was that Ravenhill asked too much of anyone who came near it. It demanded more than money. It demanded moral acceptance. To own it was to sleep beside a truth so ugly that even greed, pride, and ambition recoiled from the door. And so the house remained where it had always been, high above the valley, empty not because no one wanted it, but because those who understood it best knew that some places cannot be possessed without becoming part of what they were built to conceal. If this story stayed with you, let me know in the comments what you think the darkest part of Ravenhill Manor was. And if you enjoy these deeper archival noir mysteries, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss the next story.